So my name's Richard Young, and I'm very privileged actually to have been crunching the numbers on the DSG annual survey for the last 3 years. It's a fascinating voyage of discovery through some really rather impressive spreadsheets. And to that end, we'll come on to talk about the way that the response has risen in a few minutes when we start the presentation. But it's an incredible amount of data about the company's employees who've engaged with the DSG annual survey. And the results are obviously in the DSG annual review. In addition to this deep dive into the data, that review is the document that you should really be looking at to get the full exploration of what's gone on in the data that's come out of the surveys this year. I'd also add actually that for individual companies, DSG has a lot more information available from the surveys. So it's a really valuable tool if you're a DSG member and engage in the surveys in that way. Let's have a quick look then. I'm just going to forward this. We've titled this New Dimensions partly because the number of people that we've managed to survey has increased dramatically, a 20% increase year on year, so that more than 3,000 people completed all the shore-based questionnaires. So those are people working on land for maritime organisations, and they range from C-suite, chief exec, CFOs, that kind of thing, all the way down to juniors and trainees. So it's the full gamut. But this year, obviously, the big new development has been the seafarers survey. More than 5,000 seafarers completed the questionnaire online, and 3,300 did the full gamut of questions related to their sense of belonging, their feelings of safety at work, the kinds of questions, not identical to the other survey. So there's some interesting additional questions in the seafarer survey, but the sort of questions that we've been asking for the last 6 years on the last six surveys on the shore-based questionnaire. So that's been really interesting, and we've been able to draw some comparisons between the two, and the findings are not always exactly what you might expect. Let's quickly canter through the things that we're going to look at, and these are the areas that you'll see in the DSG annual review. So again, do get a copy of that. I'm sure Heidi and the DSG team will be able to facilitate that as soon as we're off the presentation. But broadly, partly because the kinds of organisations that submit their teams to complete this kind of survey on DEI are more likely to be progressive in these areas, we do see some real positive news coming out of it. And I think that's an important thing to celebrate. These are organisations that have taken time to think about DEI and put in place policies to evaluate through things like the DSG survey and their own surveys what's going on. So there are some great wins, but we do flag up some areas where there's a risk of complacency creeping. And I don't think we would accuse anyone of being complacent in their approaches, but there's some areas where we want to maybe have a look at progress slowing down a little bit. Again this year, and we'll go into it in more detail in a moment, middle management is key. It's great to have leadership from the top. It's great to have people feel empowered at the bottom, but middle management and the way in which they interact with employees, both on land and at sea, is a huge factor. DEI is contextual. Often we try to apply broad blanket principles to these ideas of inclusivity and equity. And actually, quite often what we find is, depending on who you are and where you are and who's around you, that experience of DEI or inclusion will be different. So it's important, in a way related to that middle management point, to think about it in those terms. I was surprised. I don't think maybe the maritime industry itself would be surprised. I think it's probably more positive about it, but as a relative ingenue when it comes to the world of seafaring, I think seafarers did pretty well. I think the sense of belonging is very good. We'll look at how they compare to shore-based employees later on. Going back to the first point, beware complacency, we do want to have another look at women. And we know that female representation and inclusion has been a big target for the maritime industry over a number of years. But there's some interesting findings from this year's survey, which I think will help frame the way in which that progresses. And then we wanted to introduce this idea of psychological safety. This is becoming a much more compelling management theme, more broadly than just maritime, more broadly than just the DEI world, but it feeds very much into both of those areas, as we can see in the survey. So let's have a quick look at the demographics. They've changed slightly this year. In the shore-based survey, for example, we've seen a slightly bigger weighting towards male respondents. This is an effect of new organizations coming into the survey that may weight slightly one way or the other. So it's not a reflection of the industry as a whole, but we do have more men respondents in the survey this year. Obviously, with a survey this size, we've still got a considerable number of women in the survey. So I think our data is robust as far as the female experience in the workplace is concerned. On ethnicity, a similar story. The number of white respondents is up to just below 50%, and that's a bit of a change from previous years. Asian respondents, so classified, self-classified, down to about 40 from 44%. But again, this is just the numbers are still very big. This is just an artifact of the new organizations coming in. And our age profile is much the same. So we've got a good spread of ages from the youngest, the kind of typically trainees, right the way through to the oldest employees on the shore. Our seafarer survey is slightly different, as you might imagine. There are different organizations, some of the same, but the organizational universe is slightly different for the seafarers. Obviously, we had a huge number, but you can see from this chart that the weighting is very much in terms of nationality towards three nations. So that's India, Malaysia, and the Philippines. There's a slightly different, it slightly affects our ability to look at, for example, some of the similar ethnicity questions that we look at in the shore-based survey. But nevertheless, it's fascinating. It's really interesting to see how attitudes break down. And to go back to that contextual DEI question, it's interesting to see how people in different environments where they have different people around them respond in the survey. Looking at the ranks on board ship, this was clearly an important area for the seafarer survey, perhaps even more important than it is for the shore-based one, partly because ships by definition have to be quite hierarchical and they have to be a sort of command and control culture. It's a question of health and safety. You know, you've got to get certain things done in certain ways. It's not like being in an HR department. I'm not having a go at HR departments, but you know, the roles and responsibilities that you have on board are obviously going to be a little bit more disciplined. In terms of the age profile, not very surprising here. The light green you can see here is the shore-based respondents. The dark green is those at sea, obviously skewing at sea more towards the younger cohort, and obviously very few in the 65 and over. Yeah, being at sea is more physically demanding, and you're more likely to have a family the older you get, and perhaps be less interested in spending considerable amounts of time away from home. The one thing to pick up here that we've put on the right-hand side of this slide, that's the proportion of seafarers who are women, who told us that they are women. 2.5% at the DSG annual conference a couple of weeks ago, last week. We had a couple of people who said before this slide came up, unprompted, about 2% of our seafarers are women. So we're about right, I think, on this. And as we'll see later on, whilst that's only about, in terms of people who actually filled out all the questions, about 84 respondents. So it's not very many in terms of the full respondent universe. It is significant enough for us to draw some conclusions. So we'll come to those in a short while. Okay, so to celebrate the wins, what do we think was working really well? Well, in these organizations, as I said, they tend to be progressive. Joining the DSG is a progressive decision. It shows that you've got really good intent to make a difference. And what we found is that between last year and this year, on all of these areas related to DEI, we've seen an improvement. So you can see there people who said they know of the D&I policy, aware of the objectives, trained on D&I, aware of the equal opportunities policy, who feel critically that they can raise discrimination, that increased. Aware of discrimination in the workplace, that dropped a little bit, down from about 43% down to about 38%. So that's moving in the right direction. But the big change that we saw, the big effect, I think, of organizations within DSG putting in place these policies is that far fewer employees are now saying that their employer should do more or could do more on DEI. That's dropped markedly. And we've broken down the biggest drops in terms of the employer do more year on year into these categories on the side here. And what's really telling is that the lower group there, the people who are less likely to have declined in the proportion of it's complicated, but the proportion of people who say the company could do more are the people who would traditionally be seen to be in some way privileged. So that's the top tier people, team leaders, men. And the people who have seen the biggest drops tend to be the people we would traditionally think of as being in some way potentially marginalized. So lesbian, gay, bisexual people, people from another ethnicity. That includes anyone who's not essentially white or Asian, or a couple of other categories that we had in the survey, and women. So that does seem to be a really good plus for the DEI programs that are going on within DSG member organizations. And we know also from last year's survey that one of the big indicators for people feeling included and happy and valued at work was having had a personal development conversation with their manager in the last 6 months. We asked that question in the survey. Obviously, some say yes, some say no. The people who say no tend obviously to feel a little bit less included, a little bit less listened to. But critically, there's a relationship between the people who have that kind of personal development conversation and their relationship to DEI issues. So it's these are the ones where we've sort of mixed some of the DEI ones and some of the personal ones. But the difference between people who've had that personal development conversation and who haven't is absolutely huge. And if you look at the bottom of that chart, that's where the DEI ones are. So where managers have been diligent with their personal development conversations, they're also delivering D&I messages, getting that training done. People know about the D&I policy, but just look at the way in which people's sense of contribution or sense of safety in speaking up about issues is so much lower for that, having not had a personal development conversation. So we see very much a confirmation of last year's finding. These are intertwined, they're correlated. We should celebrate the idea that DEI is part of that personal development conversation, and that sense of inclusion is part of that personal development conversation. These are intertwined. So what about the complacency? I mentioned before that the lesbian, gay, bisexual people had seen a proportion, that the proportion of them who said that the organization could do more on DEI had dropped markedly. But we are seeing drops year on year on some of these other measures as well. So, for example, you can see there the third stack of columns, group of columns along employer could do more. That's seen a big drop. It's still not as low as the whole survey, which is the blue bars. But we're still seeing a differential between the LGB community in the green bars and the whole survey in the blue. Some areas it's not too bad. Support in the workplace, for example, and supportive peer group. Things aren't too big. There's not too big a differential between LGB and the whole survey, but you can see there in a couple of places there's been a drop year on year from 2023. So we just need to keep an eye on that to make sure that those groups that we've seen great progress with are not necessarily feeling that they're being neglected now, that there isn't a sort of complacency creeping in, that we've ticked the box, we've done the job, we can move on now. I don't think that's necessarily a safe assumption. But interestingly, when we looked at the shore-based and seafarers, when it came to the LGB community, their numbers were actually better than the shore-based respondents. we're still sort of unpicking a little bit how the methodology is working at sea, but I think that's kind of encouraging. I suspect some of that has to do with the fact that people feel confident enough on board to be able to tell the survey, even if it's a completely anonymous and private survey, where we reassure people that their information will not go to anyone and they won't be identified. Perhaps those people who are confident enough to say, yes, I'm gay or lesbian or bisexual on the on board ship, perhaps have a little bit more confidence in their environment in general. And we do see some disparities in the realm of ethnicity. It's still true that I think the one that stands out for me there is the ability to raise discrimination where there's a reasonably big gap. And just to emphasize here, I've zeroed the graphs at 65%. So when we're talking about the differentials here, they're not vast, but they do tell us a story. So I think that's the other important thing to emphasize just as we hit this slide. We're not zeroing in on naught. If you put a naught scale on this axis, the differences don't look very big at all. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. But you are more likely to say that you can feel you can be yourself if you're white than if you're Asian. You are uh, more likely to say you can raise discrimination. Having said that, if you're an Asian respondent in the shore-based survey, you're more likely to say you've got a supportive peer group. So it's a mixed bag, but I think it shows us that there are differences in the survey, and we'll come on to some of the reasons why that might be in terms of the methodology shortly. What we did find was that the share of the top jobs has changed a little bit. Quick reminder, the share of white respondents has changed, has gone up again this year. So that dip, if you look at the right-hand side, the right-hand graph, you can see that dip in 2023 in terms of share of the top jobs for white respondents. And that's gone back up again, partly because the universe has changed and there are more white people in the survey as a whole. But it is telling that 70% of the top three categories in terms of the CEO and the heads of department and directors, 70% of those jobs are going to white respondents, even though they're only 50%, just under 50% of the survey. And again, for Asian respondents, about 40% of the survey, but about 19% of those top jobs. So there's obviously a disparity there in terms of the most senior roles on the shore-based survey. And that's, again, something to have a think about when we're considering, and we'll come on to fish out of water in a second, when we're considering the ethnicity question. And we've not really focused on respondents who told us they had a disability in previous years. We looked at it this year partly because the numbers seem to be going backwards a little bit. So the grey bars are people who told us they had a disability in 2023. The green bar is the 2024 numbers. So what you're looking for there is the change between the green and the grey. And you can see that there's a little bit of a drop here. People with a disability feel less able to raise discrimination. They feel their contribution is less valued. They feel less able to, less safe in speaking up. And there's a marginal drop in ability to be themselves. Interestingly, when we look at the share of the entire survey with a disability and compare that to the levels of seniority, and this obviously is in the shore-based survey, we see that the share of people in the top jobs with a disability is about comparable to the survey as a whole. So it's an interesting one. Clearly, you can make progress in an organization if you have a disability, but your sense of safety, your sense of being included and considered is dropping a little bit. And we'll come on to some of the free text comments in a bit, but we did have several comments this year, which we seem to get more of them. I couldn't tell you the exact numbers, but we seem to get more comments this year from people talking about accessibility issues in shore-based facilities. So that's again something that shouldn't be overlooked. So what about this idea of context? Well, we wondered, taking the sort of blanket numbers for something like the UK, for example, or for people who are uh, um, uh, um, of different nationalities across the world. It's valuable analysis, but we wondered whether there was a difference between people who were in the majority in a particular location and people who weren't. So with over 400 responses from people based in the UK, and the UK is a reasonably multicultural country by global standards, and because we were able to cut by both ethnicity and nationality, we were able to look at a decent sample size of people who were in the UK, who identified as British, who identified as not British, who identified as white, who identified, which is still obviously the majority ethnicity in the UK, and who identified as another ethnicity. And you can see the numbers here, the sort of differential. So if you crudely look at just the UK, about 83.3% of respondents said that they could raise discrimination concerns, which is encouraging. That's not bad. You want that to be higher. Clearly, everyone should feel able to raise concerns about discrimination. But if you identify as British, that's 85%, a bit higher. If you're non-British, it's about 75%. So it's again not vast. It's still good that 3 out of 4 people who are not native Brits can raise discrimination. But that differential tells us a little bit of a story, and it's similar if you're identifying yourself as white or if you're identifying as another ethnicity. There is that differential again. And we see a similar pattern with the people who say the employer could do more for an inclusive workplace, where if you're in a minority category locally, then you're more likely to say that your employer could do more. Just one other quick observation. We didn't include it on this survey, but it's in the report. We also looked at people in Asia Pacific who are located in Asia Pacific, and we found a slightly different story there. If you're white working in Asia Pac, you're much more likely to feel that you're able to raise discrimination. And this is an interesting artifact. So that was like, oh, so fish out of water doesn't work both ways. It absolutely does. But a big factor there is the fact that a lot of the people who work in Asia Pac who are white or from a non Asian nationality tend to be in more senior roles. They're probably expats who are on assignment in a senior role in Asia Pacific region. And one of the things we do know is seniority is very well correlated with people feeling like they trust their organization to do the right thing. And that comes through sort of loud and clear in the shore-based survey. It's a slightly more nuanced picture on at sea, but we can come on to that in a minute. So Heidi, how am I doing for time? Oh,
You're doing great for time. We've
fantastic.
got 22 minutes.
Fantastic. I haven't seen any questions come up in the chat, so please do type any questions in there as we go along. I have got it on, so hopefully I'll be able to see them pop in if they do come up. Right, let's move on to seafarers then. Any questions about the shore base, just ping them in, and I'll address them either now or at the end. So on seafarers, again, the question set was slightly different, but what I've done is tried to select the questions that map onto the shore-based survey, particularly where we're doing a comparison between the two. I looked at different categories of seafarer to see how they would compare on some of these areas. And you can see there's very little difference between the categories on some of these areas. So I think supported at work, for example, do you feel well supported in the workplace? Not only is the overall number very high, I mean, no one's dipping below 85% on that category, which maps extremely encouragingly onto the shore-based survey. But everyone's at more or less at a level. I mean, the differentials there are very small. Women probably at about 86%, but that's still very high. And for the all seafarer survey, which is a proxy for men, since 97.5% of the rest of the survey are men, all seafarers in this context may as well be men. They're only at sort of 92. So So the differential there is not great, but you will see some differentials there. For example, the two I'll pick out are the lesbian, gay, bisexual identified seafarers, where you are seeing a big difference on the my contribution is valued and I can be myself at work. Um, Again, I'm actually quite encouraged that 77 odd percent, 76% of the LGBT seafarers feel they can be themselves, but that is a gap. There's no doubt about it between them and the rest of the survey. So that's something to be aware of. And the contribution valued is probably even more important. Why is that? What are we seeing in that data there that only 60% of LGBT seafarers are saying they feel their contribution is valued? That's got to be worthy of more exploration. The other one to pick out here, I think, is I've had DEI training. And what's really encouraging here is the numbers are hovering sort of just above, just below 60%. For the whole survey, it's about 63. But clearly, these DSG members are doing brilliant work in terms of their induction programs. And DEI must be creeping in now to those induction programs for younger seafarers coming into the industry, because that cadet number up over 75%, I think is really, really positive. And I'm going to be fascinated in the next couple of years to see how that starts to filter through, either through ongoing training programs for more seasoned seafarers or for those cadets moving through their organizations over time. Again, we looked at all the different ranks to see, we looked at different ranks and different examples of people to see how they would feel about their experience of their company. These are questions that we don't ask the shore-based respondents. We'll think about doing it to make the comparability, but we were really interested in how seafarers felt about their organization. So these three questions in dark green, do you feel proud to work for your company? The light green question, do you feel you have good career progression in this organization? And then we compared that with, do you feel your contributions valued? What jumps out to me here is that among the lesbian, gay, bisexual respondents, 100% of them felt proud to work for their company. 100% of them felt they had good career progression. And yet their contribution valued, as we saw on the previous slide, was down at 60%. So again, this is something that we need to explore a little bit more. I think the companies might be doing something great. We need to look at those middle management positions. We need to look at the way in which they feel they're interacting with the people around them. I think the sort of data on this slide sort of partly tells that story. Have you felt discriminated against? For all responses, just 5.6%, which is pretty good. The ratings, the more junior members of the team on board, they're actually lower than the senior ranks and middle ranks. Middle ranks a little bit higher, 7.2%. I sort of wonder whether middle ranks maybe are more likely to feel they're suffering discrimination because they have a lot of responsibilities, but they're not in the most senior positions. So it's that kind of pressure rolling downhill, really, and they're having to manage more junior members of the crew more directly. So perhaps that's a kind of stress thing. And certainly some of the comments, free text comments we had in the survey would indicate that might be the case. But it's really telling that both women and lesbian, gay, bisexual seafarers are much more likely to have felt discriminated against, and that's probably the reason we're seeing some of these other bits of data coming through. And we're going to come on into now in a couple of slides some more interesting data on women. But how do they compare with the shore-based colleagues? Well, interestingly, if you look at these, which were questions we asked both surveys, have you been trained on D&I? Is your contribution valued? Is it safe for you to speak up at work? Are you supported in the workplace, well supported, and can you be yourself? The seafarers are actually doing, as a whole survey, better. This is the differential between them and the shore-based respondents. And across the board on those particular categories of question, the seafarers are doing better, particularly on supported in the workplace and be yourself. Again, I can only speculate, so we can make some inferences here, but I suspect that feeling better supported in the workplace is partly because on board ship it's a tight-knit crew. You're working in close proximity for prolonged periods of time with no breaks. Obviously, you're eating, sleeping, and working together for weeks or even months at a time. It feels more supportive in that sense, potentially. Um, the sort of telling thing here is where there are minus numbers. So you can see here for the LGB community on board ship, they're less likely to have experienced DNI training, they're less likely to feel their contributions valued, but they're still getting that support in the workplace bump. So that's kind of interesting. The other area is the senior officers, who are less likely to have been trained on DNI than the senior manager levels on land, and are less likely to feel their contribution is valued than their senior management levels on land. Again, we can speculate a little bit, I would say probably this is because they're constrained a little bit by process and procedure when they're at sea as senior officers. But again, it's something that individual companies can explore a little bit more. All right, so how are we doing? We're on slide 23. So let's have a little look at the women's situation then. We track the share of women in different job roles, and we've done so since the survey began. The data starts here in 2020 when we had a bigger sample size in 2019. So I wanted to make sure the samples were reasonable. And what you can see there is that there's quite apart from the junior and trainee level where women were, there was a higher proportion of women than you'd find in the general population. By and large, there was a relatively low share of women in those different levels of seniority in shore-based roles. We were really encouraged in 2022. The numbers started to look a little bit better. They'd risen in 2020, 21. There was a bit of a plateau in 2022, but we had seen that top level, that head of department director level, which is the sort of dark green line that's at the bottom, that had ticked up markedly and gone over 20%, and that was kind of encouraging. But things have sort of slowed down since then. And I think whilst people in mid-level roles, they're sort of approaching 50%, that's kind of good, but we've seen a decline in those senior and team leader and a sort of plateauing of the head of department level. And possibly the way to understand this graph best is to say two things, really. First of all, you can tell the level of seniority of the different categories of management here by the share of women that are in them. So literally the lowest lines here are the most senior roles, and the highest lines, the biggest share of women are the most junior roles. So I think that's still telling a story, but also the spread of the different roles has widened since 2020, and what we really want to see is those bottom lines creeping up closer to the top lines, obviously closer to 50%, but narrowing to show us that the pipeline for women is delivering into the more senior roles. So that's again something to look at. Very quickly on this one, we've always known that women tend to be underrepresented in the more technical roles, the engineering, the operations, the IT roles on land. I mean, that's a general thing. That's not about the maritime industry, but clearly there are a whole bunch of maritime specific technical roles where women are underrepresented. We've seen some gains. So technical fleet operations has risen again after a dip in 2023. IT's plateaued at about 1 in 4, but I suspect if you looked across the IT industry, that wouldn't be terrible. Operations has drifted back a little bit, so it's just an area to consider. Is there a pipeline of sort of female engineering and operations types coming in, and how are we making sure that those people feel included as part of those teams? What about women at sea then? What about women seafarers? Well, it's a small sample. As I said, it's about it's just under 100 in the survey, but these numbers are not great. And in a way, they're not surprising, but they're obviously something that we need to look at tackling. And I think organically, I suspect things will change a little bit as people get more used to how they interact with female seafarers, how crews operate. It might be interesting, for example, to look at the way um, military navies have looked at women seafarers and how they've adapted to um, women at sea in those environments. But we asked, have you experienced any psychological harassment in the last year? Have you experienced any sexual harassment? And the numbers are really not encouraging. So, psychological harassment, about 1 in 5 seafarers say that they've experienced some kind of bullying. So, psychological harassment includes bullying or other sort of related activities. It's 50%. 50% of the women have experienced that kind of harassment. On sexual harassment, clearly this is problematic. A quarter of women say they've experienced some kind of sexual harassment, compared to only 1.7% of the entire survey, and that's for functional reasons. That's effectively men, and they're less likely to expect action to be taken when harassment's been reported, and they're more likely to feel discriminated against. What's fascinating to me is, despite these numbers and their experience of those kind of negative experiences, they still feel broadly positive about life on board. And so I think there's a resilience there which we should acknowledge and say that's actually really positive. But we need to get that idea of expecting harassment to be dealt with up so that they feel more confident in addressing it, and for mechanisms to be in place on board so that there is more of an expectation of culture change. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. I'm conscious that I'm running a little bit low on time now, so we'll go through psychological safety. So I did a quick analysis in terms of the amount of time people have been in post. So this is shore-based respondents, because we were interested. This is psychological safety is an idea about optimal performance at work, which is gaining a lot of traction globally. I think a lot of management thinkers and HR experts are very interested in this idea of psychological safety, and it ties in with a lot of the questions that we ask. Do you feel supported at work? Do you feel confident in raising problems? So we looked at the way in which different groups of people from different time served in post responded to these questions about being yourself, being supported in the workplace, and having your contribution valued. To emphasize again, these are not massive, massive disparities. This graph starts at 70% and goes through to 95%. But you can see, if you've been in post less than a year, you do feel more supported in the workplace. You are more likely to feel you can be yourself, and you do feel that your contribution is more valued. You're more likely to feel those things than if you've been in post a bit longer. Interestingly, we see an uptick for the 10 years or more on be yourself and knows the D&I policy. I'm not going to say that there's a correlation there, but I think it feels like when you have been in post for a long time, you kind of think, well, I can just be myself. I know how the dynamics of this workplace operate, and so I can relax a little bit about feeling confident in my own skin. Equally, if you're in post less than a year, you probably haven't been exposed to the cultural norms that force you to behave in a certain different way. But what we want is for those middle groups to feel confident too, and that's partly about the way in which the workplace culture shows that it values people being themselves. Let's have a look at the seafarer respondents then. We asked in this question, the psychological harassment question, your experience of psychological harassment, and we just looked at the bottom 5 and top 5 categories. Really interesting. Obviously, we talked already about the LGBT community and women on board and how they're much more likely to experience psychological harassment of some kind. But pertinent to the previous slide about shore-based employees, it's ratings that actually are less likely to experience psychological harassment. So they come in fresh-faced, they're junior, they perhaps don't have some of the stress of responsibilities, and they feel obviously that they suffer from less psychological harassment. Cadets also were in that bottom 5 category for having experienced that kind of negative experience on board. So again, it's important not to gloss over the fact that different groups of people may feel less included or more under pressure. So one other thing I wanted to quickly add, I think I've got another 5 minutes on the this before we get to any additional questions and Heidi's wrap up, is just this idea of the free text responses. And the reason I want to touch on that quickly is we did, and you'll see this in the DSG annual review, we did a sentiment analysis from the free text answers. It took a long time to do that, and it is an inexact science. Trying to categorize people's comments about what their company could do more to increase and improve the experience around the DEI areas is very subjective. However, what we did see is that there's been a marked drop-off in the last 2 years of people requesting additional policies around DEI. And it seems like what's happened is companies have put in place DEI-related policies. They are encouraging people to speak up. They are saying that they'll have a minimal tolerance for exclusion in the workplace. But where we've seen a big uptick now is people wanting there to be transparency and accountability, better representation at all levels, particularly for underrepresented groups. Excuse me. And we've also seen a greater desire for what we broadly categorize as an inclusive culture in the workplace. And I think that's another brilliant facet of this data, is that it shows us how DEI has to evolve over time. It's not something you can put a stamp on. We put in place a policy, we've put in place an attitude from senior management and expect it to work. It changes over time. It changes with context. Expectations amongst employees also shift, and a good DEI program will evolve over time to address each of those areas. So Heidi, shall I hand back to you for the focus areas?
Absolutely, thanks, Richard. And we have a couple of questions in the chat before we get there, and I will. There, so we have. I think there's a point for discussion more, which we'll, if we have time, we can come on to, Rosa, about the success of the industry in attracting female talent. In terms of, we have a question as well here. Can we clarify the percentage of total respondents who are female and how many identified as LGBT? We can come back to that, and it's certainly, we will have that within the report. But while we're looking at that, there was, to answer that question, we did do some, at the very beginning, we did some presentation on some of those answers, not all of them. In terms of this slide, the focus areas, what we're really talking about here, and again, it's more detailed in the annual review, so in the written report itself, is that what are we encouraging organisations to be considering? And that's based on our expertise, is focusing on DEI and maritime across the globe, working with shore-based personnel and seafarers, but also 20 years DEI experience gained from other sectors that are inarguably, I would say, more advanced for some of the team here at the DSG. So you have an amazing blend of expertise to draw upon. In terms of these focus areas, I think it's really important that we keep in mind one size does not fit all. You cannot apply a blanket DI initiative across your organisation. It really needs to be bespoke. And it's really important that when you're looking at these, that they're solving real business issues as well, because that's where we find you can really fast track your progress. And it was something that came up a lot at our conference last week in London, was how DEI policies and initiatives are adapted to make sure they meet the needs of different groups of employees. So we really strongly can see progress when that's done, and would encourage organisations continue to focus on this. We are seeing a big increase in organisations who employ shore and sea-based personnel focusing on DEI. And one of the areas of focus is to ensure that actually you are aligned across both. Sometimes we have seen, and less so now, but historically sometimes what we saw were organisations applying one DEI set of policies and initiatives for shore and another for sea. And of course, what actually the benefit of creating one employee community overall is you have shared language, you have a shared understanding, although you will still have a bespoke approach because, as I've just said, one size does not fit all. So again, really focus on that, and particularly now where we're looking increasingly at career pathways for individuals, that one DEI language and programs really supports that as well. So really important to keep that in mind. Effective managers and effective management. We were amazed last year actually with the analysis when we saw that correlation between, have you had a personal development conversation the last 6 months with your manager, and how that translated into areas such as psychological safety and an increase in awareness and understanding of things like DEI policies and initiatives. Effective management is crucial. Inclusive leaders, inclusive managers, they make a tangible difference to you as your organisation. So really double down on that. Richard's spoken about the safety, the psychological safety. We know, of course, the need for physical safety as well. If you don't know it, and again, we presented at the conference on this last week, there's something called the Bradley curve, which is a really great demonstration of how the proven link from inclusion to an increase in physical safety. Because what you find is when teams look out for not just themselves as individuals, but for everybody in the team, they're actually the safety incidents go down and lost time incidents go down. But of course, it also contributes to a speak up culture and to the psychological safety as well. So we can really see this increasing in focus and increasing in positive outcomes as well. And I think our final point, and this resonates through all of the work we do, is it's really important to maintain your momentum. This isn't a one-off. You can't pick it up and put it down either if you want to have enduring impact. Again, last week at the conference, we introduced our own equation for success, if you like, when it comes to DEI. And for enduring impact, you've got to have purpose. You've got to be very clear about that. You've got to have scaffolding, and you've got to be persistent. And that's where this maintaining momentum really comes in, because I think it was put beautifully last week that this is a journey. You're not going to get to an end point and find that all of your work is done, as much as that would be really lovely to consider. You've got to keep coming back to it, revisiting it to make sure that what you're doing is still relevant and is still making progress. And you've got to keep going to ensure that momentum. So this is more detailed within the report, and that report will be coming out next week. But those are the areas where we suggest that you focus within the industry. Now, in terms of Q&A, okay, so Richard, did you have anything you wanted to add while I just look at these questions coming through?
Well, you mentioned there were a couple of questions about sharing the survey. The shore-based survey, we had quite a big community of people who didn't say their sexuality was heterosexual, but the breakdown of that is kind of interesting. And so, very briefly, because it highlights one of the interesting facets of the survey. We had 106 people who said that they were lesbian, gay, or bisexual. We had another 240 who put either they prefer not to say or other. Now, we tend not to analyze them for the data that we've presented today. And the reason for that is that it's very difficult to determine whether or not prefer not to say is I'm not necessarily happy sharing this with you on a survey, or I object to being asked about this in a survey. And so picking apart that can be quite delicate. And so focusing in on those 106 LGB respondents, I think, is the sensible thing to do from a certainty of data. If you're interested in those, then we can let us know, and we can offer an analysis. Broadly speaking, if you incorporate those other groups, the sentiment scores tend to go down a little bit. But again, we're not sure whether that's because if you've got a group of prefer not to says in there who are objecting to the idea of the survey, that they are downgrading their scores in other areas because they're just generally annoyed. So it's important not to make too many broad assumptions based on those kind of categories. What was the other question, Heidi?
So the other one was about, the next one was actually about, it says, regarding the success of our industry in attracting female talent, are we truly making strides in this area? I think that's part of a much bigger conversation. What I would say is when you look at that through a DEI lens, those organisations who are being really intentional with their recruitment are making strides, yes. But it involves a host of measures being taken within the recruitment process, and probably too much detail to go into now. So yes, we are making strides, but as we're highlighting here, there's most certainly work to be done. So it is that critical area of maintaining momentum, and really happy to explore this more with you. So by all means, do reach out. We've just got the slide here. You've got our email address there at the bottom, info@diversitystudygroup.com. So by all means, get in touch. And I think also we've had a query about CREST and the mentoring program, and how perhaps that might differ from some other offerings. Again, if you'd like to get information on CREST Maritime Mentoring and the alumni that comes with, by all means, let us know, because we're more than happy to provide that detail and on any areas of the work that we do. Just conscious that obviously for today, we're here for the data ahead of the report going live and being published next week.
One thing I add on the progress for women, I think we highlighted there the way in which the share of women in different management roles or management levels was changing over time. I think that would be a good indication of the pipeline working. And so whether that's attracting people into the industry is obviously a slightly different question. In terms of the sentiment we see, I think what's encouraging is we have, I think I'm just looking at the data here, 1,125 women respondents in this year's survey, and their broad sentiment about feeling that they can be themselves at work. That's the kind of, if we were looking for a very crude measure of how to rank the different categories of people, that would probably be the one that we go for. And they're still significantly above a whole bunch of other categories of people. So in a sense, we are seeing the industry delivering some positive experiences. The flip side of that is if, and I'll give you an example, team leaders whose sentiment is marginally below that of women have a less of a sense of being themselves at work, then there's probably a job to be done with them as much as there is to be addressed around women. So I think that idea of creating a truly inclusive workplace, a workplace where people do feel valued, feel that sense of psychological safety, I think is universal. But as we've said before, it is also very much driven by context, and so your middle management teams being supported, I think, is so critical.
Very good point. And we have another question. Do you think the survey results show there is a DEI fatigue or backlash? My personal experience is that leadership are just getting a little bit fed up of DEI. We might actually be going backwards. Richard, do you want to take that first, and then I can give a bit of context around what we're seeing within the DSG on a broader scale? Because again, this was something that was spoken about in a lot of detail last week at the conference.
Yeah. Interestingly, I don't think it's necessarily fatigue from senior management, maybe a little bit of complacency. Certainly they buy into it, the very senior managers buy into it based on the survey results more than anybody else. I think there's an actual fact, if you look at the extent to which they think that their organizations could do more, I was just looking at this just now, the could your employer do more? The top tiers, that's C-suites and heads of department, who are the most comfortable feeling themselves at work, are quite likely to say their employer could do more. That is them, basically. So that's kind of interesting finding. That doesn't suggest to me that there's fatigue at the most senior levels. I suspect at other levels there might be. And again, this, I don't want to labor the point too much, but this idea of context is really important. So if you look at some of the comments from the seafarers, for example, where people have a specific beef about their contract or their bonus or the fact that they're maybe getting a different bonus structure to somebody else on board, they'll often now see that through a DEI lens, which is a mark of how well the concept is kind of embedded. They're starting to see that now as something that should be addressed by DEI policies. But you also have a lot of people who are basically saying this has gone too far. As an organization, I think you probably have to take a view on some of those, that kind of anti-woke, that kind of DEI fatigue, because some of them are just not that pleasant. I mean, there were a couple of people who said sort of quite unpleasant things about having women on board ship, for example, and there are others who will cite religious reasons why they shouldn't have gay people on board ship, and so not all of the anti-woke, the sort of the DEI backlash is rooted in something which is related to things that we would necessarily consider as good managers and people running organizations were necessarily coming from a good place. So yeah, that's just a snapshot of a couple of examples.
And I would think what I would say overall is that generally it's a really interesting point. We're not seeing a big backlash. Obviously, regionally, that can be very different indeed. We know in the US at the moment, there are some really key challenges that need addressing. Where we find it makes a real difference is for organisations to be really explicit, coming back to that PSP equation, when they're really explicit, and this is our purpose, this is why we are doing this is why this matters to us as a business. And for leaders to really also be explicit about, this is why it matters to me as a leader, this is why we're doing it. So I think that if people feel that there is fatigue or backlash, it often does stem from a real lack of understanding about why these things are happening, so why DEI initiatives are happening and what they mean. So it's really important that that is communicated. And again, we had a really strong session last week on communications and the importance of communications throughout your business, through multifaceted channels, cannot be underestimated when it comes to DEI. It's an absolutely crucial part of this area of work. So I don't think we're going backwards, actually. One of the things that really has struck me with this data and just with all of everything we've had going on in the last week is we are really making progress. We spoke about the headwinds we're experiencing, but we've also, as a community, a DEI maritime community, we took the time to consider those tailwinds, the things that are helping propel us forward. And we were really encouraged by the fact that so many more tailwinds for DEI exist at the moment than we've had in previous years. So the story is really encouraging. And of course, yes, we're in a community. That community is of people who are committed, who want to be doing more. But that community, that commitment, that progress, it's growing year on year and it's increasing year on year. So I'd say loads of work still to be done. I'm not sure I'll ever not say that, but absolutely we're not going backwards.
Yeah, can I just add one very quick thing to that, which is
absolutely.
Looking through the free text answers particularly, and I think I made this point already, but it bears reiteration. It does seem like a majority of people have bought into the idea that an inclusive workplace is a good workplace and that there should be policies in place that offer protections to people when that isn't happening. What people want to see is action. They want to see results. They want to see it embedded in the way in which their workplace operates. So it's less about having rah-rah sessions where you're talking about DEI as a sort of defined concept, and much more about, actually, is this my lived experience as an employee in these organizations? Is it part of my workplace culture? Am I seeing results? Am I seeing more people who look like me in senior management positions, that kind of stuff? And so I think, I completely agree with Heidi, and what I'm looking forward to seeing in the data next year is that shifting again, and people saying, actually, you know what, that this is starting to happen, and we're seeing the results, and I don't feel it's imposed on me. I feel it's part of the workplace culture.
Yeah, great point. And I think a great point to bring us to the end pretty much of our session. Just want to thank you. First of all, thank you to our members, because it's their commitment to DEI that enables us to share actually what's going on in the sector among those who are committed to DEI and who are happy to do this level of sharing. We always want to be getting more data and understanding things in more detail. So if you would like to join this, then obviously please get in touch. Thank you, Richard, for an amazing presentation. We're so lucky that you love the data to the level that you do, and the insights you bring and the way that you look at it just brings some really different insights forward, I think. So thank you very much. I don't think I have anything else to add, other than thank all of you for turning up as well. And if you've got any questions, you know where to find us. So thank you all very, very much.